In this video, I'm going to talk about how to add new lines to a derivation using the rule Modus Ponens, and we'll talk about what that rule is. But before we get to the rule Modus Ponens, I want to point out that we've seen different kinds of moves, different kinds of things you can do in a derivation. There are two parts to setting up a derivation. That's what we talked about in the previous video. One is that you can add a show line, and you have to add a show line as your first line, and it needs to be a show line of the conclusion. And the second thing you can do is you can enter premises. And once you've done those two things, you've set the derivation up. And then you need to complete the derivation by moving it forward. So the first thing you can do is you can apply the rule Modus Ponens. And we'll see other rules as we proceed, and we'll also actually see other ways to set up derivations. But for right now, the setup is just the show line and the premises. And for this unit, we'll only be using one rule, the rule Modus Ponens. And then when you, at a certain point, you'll be able to complete the derivation, and you do that by boxing and canceling with direct derivation. What does that mean? You'll find out in the next video. So right now, we're going to learn about this rule. So in this scenario we've been considering, you have the sentence, if he doesn't confess, she will leave him, and he doesn't confess, and so she will leave him. And that's this general form, if antecedent, then consequent, and antecedent, therefore consequent. And we decided that any reasoning that has this form is valid. And so this form of reasoning where you infer the consequent of a conditional from that conditional and the antecedent of the conditional, we call that modus ponens, or MP. Modus ponens is Latin. Its name is in Latin because it was given that name by Catholic monks in the Middle Ages in Europe, and they were using Latin. But we'll just call it MP. It's an inference rule, meaning that it's a rule for making inferences. An inference being, oh, I hear some claims, here's another one that's true if those initial ones are. And it's valid, right? Whenever the premises are true, so is the conclusion. So let's consider, is this an example of MP? Well, we have if Bob is a falcon, then Bob flies is one premise, and Bob is a falcon is our other premise, and the conclusion will be Bob flies. Is this modus ponens? It is. We have a conditional, if Bob is a falcon, then Bob flies, and the other premise is its antecedent, Bob is a falcon. And not only that, but the conclusion, Bob flies, is the consequent of the conditional. So this is an instance of modus ponens. Hooray. Let's look at another possible inference. So here we have the same first premise, if Bob is a falcon, then Bob flies, but the second premise is different, it's Bob flies. And the conclusion is also different, it's Bob is a falcon. So is this an example of MP? No, it's not. The premises are not right. The premises need to be a conditional, and then the antecedent of the conditional. And the conditional we have, Bob is a falcon, the antecedent of that, the conditional is if Bob is a falcon, then Bob flies. And so to do modus ponens with that, we would need Bob is a falcon. If we wanted to do modus ponens with Bob flies, we need another conditional whose antecedent was Bob flies. But since the two premises don't match in the right way, the one premise is not the antecedent of the other, it's not an instance of modus ponens. Also, the conclusion doesn't match either. The conclusion needs to be the same as the consequent of the conditional premise, and that's not true. So this is definitely not modus ponens. It doesn't have the right form. It has the wrong form. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's invalid. There, as we'll see, a lot of valid inference rules, but this is also invalid. And what do we mean by, so remember, an inference rule is valid. What does that mean? Whenever the premises are true, so is the conclusion. But that's not the case here. It's possible for the premises of this argument to be true, while the conclusion is false. So imagine that Bob is a hummingbird, then Bob flies, and it's also true that if Bob is a falcon, then Bob flies, but it's not true that Bob is a falcon. Bob is a hummingbird, and therefore is not a falcon. So in that situation, in the situation where Bob turns out to be a hummingbird, the premises are true and the conclusion is false. Now in other situations, all three premises might be true. If, for example, Bob is a falcon, then all three premises the two premises and the conclusion are true. But that doesn't make the argument valid. It's not enough that there is one situation where the premises are true and the conclusion is true. it needs to be the case that in every situation, if the premises are true in that situation, then so is the conclusion. And that's not true here. In the situation where Bob is a hummingbird, we would have true premises and a false conclusion. So not only is this not modus ponens, it's an invalid rule, or an invalid inference. So you want to learn how to recognize modus ponens, because you're going to be using it a lot. And in particular, you want to learn how to recognize it in the formal language. So what does it look like there? Well, we say for any sentences, x and y, if you have a conditional, if y then x, and you also have y, then you can infer x. So you can apply this rule whenever you want. Whenever you have the premises of the rule, if y then x and y, then you can infer the conclusion x. And by the way, let me just add a note, a terminological note. Sometimes when we talk about premises, we're talking about the premises of the whole argument. Sometimes when we're talking about premises, we're talking about premises that we apply a rule to. So you want to just be aware of that the way in which the word premise is used is, in some sense, it means whatever I'm starting with to get something else, but sometimes it means the premises of the whole argument, and sometimes it means, oh, I'm applying the rule to these things, to those particular sentences. Okay, so how about using MP in our derivation? Well, it's like this. So we have lines, our first line was show Q, our second and third lines were the premises of the derivation of the argument, and we can apply modus ponens to lines 2 and 3 because they are conditional if P then Q and its antecedent P. And when we do that, we would get the consequent Q. So how do we write this out? Well, on a new line, we say for, it's a new line, and we write the consequent Q. And we need to give a justification because we're saying that Q is true if the premises are. And what's our reason for thinking that? Well, our reason for thinking that is that 2, 3 modus ponens. We say, we're applying the rule modus ponens to lines 2 and 3, and the rule modus ponens tells us that if 2 and 3 are true, then 4 is also true. So given that the premises are true, 2 and 3 are true, and given that 2 and 3 are true, and modus ponens is a good rule, which it is, Q is true, and so Q is true if the premises of the whole argument are. So we apply modus ponens to particular lines, and in this case we apply it to lines 2 and 3, and we get Q. Now Q is the conclusion, and so we're almost done. But there's a way in our derivations in which we mark the fact that we're done, and so it's called direct derivation, and I will talk about that in the next video.